Serengeti Plains, mid-morning. The heat has already begun to settle, wrapping itself over the grasslands like a thick, invisible blanket. The light is sharp, unbroken by clouds, and the horizon quivers faintly in the rising shimmer. Out here, sound travels far, but what Elias hears does not belong to the usual rhythm of the plains. It is low, uneven, and carries a weight that makes him slow his stride, not the deep, chesty roar that sends gazelles scattering. Not the short huff of warning given to trespassers. This is drawn out and broken at the edges, as if pulled from somewhere deep and met with resistance on its way out. He stops for a moment, tilts his head toward the sound, and begins to trace its direction. The grass is short here, cropped close by, grazing herds that passed through weeks ago. The terrain dips in shallow rolls, offering just enough rise to hide something lying low. Elias moves carefully, his boots brushing through the dry stems with a whispering scrape. The call comes again, muffled this time, as though the source has shifted its position or turned away. He is trained to notice small changes in sound. It means the animal is alive, but perhaps struggling. As he crests the slight rise, the shape comes into view. A lioness, her tawny body half blended into the dust, lies in the open without the cover of a thicket or the shadow of a tree. Her head rests flat against the ground, muzzle tipped towards the earth. Even at this distance, Elias can see the effort in her breathing. Her sides lift high, hold for a moment, and then fall again, each cycle slower than it should be. The rest of her remains almost perfectly still. Her ears move occasionally, a small flick to chase a fly or acknowledge a sound, but her tail lies slack behind her. Elias halts, keeping a safe distance, 30 paces at least, and waits. A healthy lioness would already have stood or shifted to watch him closely. Instead, she turns her head slightly, not enough to lift it, and meets his eyes. There is no flash of warning in the look, only a weary, measured awareness. The air between them is still except for the low rustle of the grass around his legs. He keeps his hands low and his posture open, careful not to advance in a way that could trigger her instincts to flee or defend. In the heat, even the flies seem sluggish, drifting in slow circles over her flanks before settling again. Her eyes close for a brief moment and open again, heavy-lidded. The muscles of her chest contract and he catches the faintest sound, that same low moan that led him here. It vibrates in the air for only a second before fading into the heat-haze silence. His eyes trace her body, moving from her forelegs to her belly, then to her hindquarters. That's where he sees it, a faint patch of darker fur along her inner thigh, clotted with dust. Beneath it, the soil looks slightly darker, as though something damp had touched it not long ago. He takes in each detail without rushing. Her claws on the front paws are half extended into the dust, their tips darkened by soil, as if she has been bracing herself against the ground. The skin along her shoulders shifts in small tremors when she exhales. From the slow rhythm of her breathing and the lack of tension in her posture toward him, he can tell this is not a direct confrontation, but the situation is no less dangerous. Any predator in distress can be unpredictable, and here, in the open, her options are limited. Elias murmurs quietly, letting his voice carry only far enough to reach her. "It's okay, girl." The words are more for the tone than the meaning. She may not understand them, but the steady cadence can sometimes ease tension. Her gaze lingers on him for a heartbeat before she blinks, slow and deliberate, and turns her head slightly away. He notes the absence of any attempt to rise, even to shift her weight. That tells him more than any wound would. She is conserving every shred of energy she has left. The sun presses harder on both of them, the light bouncing up from the pale earth. Out here, without shade, heat exhaustion can come quickly, even for a predator built for this climate. If she cannot stand, she cannot hunt. Without movement, she cannot reach water. Her body will lose strength faster than it can recover, and scavengers, always watching for weakness, will eventually move in. The risks are direct and simple. If she cannot move soon, she will die here. If she tries too early, she may collapse, leaving herself completely exposed. He watches a small bird land just a few feet from her head, pecking at the ground in short, nervous bursts. She does not even flick her ears in its direction. A lioness in good health would not tolerate such closeness from a potential nuisance. This indifference speaks of her exhaustion. The bird hops twice and then lifts away, its shadow crossing briefly over her face before disappearing. Elias shifts his position slightly, lowering himself to one knee in the grass. From here, he can better see the slight rise of her belly, the faint tightening of the muscles beneath the skin. He notices the occasional twitch in her rear leg, small, almost involuntary. The call comes again. This time it is quieter, almost caught in her throat before it escapes. It is not the short, urgent bark of alarm, nor the deep resonance used to call others. It's a strained, effortful sound, the kind that comes from work that is not yet done. Elias narrows his focus, reading each subtle cue, the way her nostrils flare briefly before settling, the way her chest pauses at the top of each breath as if holding on to the air before letting it go. Around them, the plains stretch in every direction, empty for now. But emptiness can fill quickly here. The scent of distress travels on the wind. A scavenger, hyena, jackal, or even a male lion could appear without warning. That knowledge settles heavily in his mind. If help is needed, it must be measured. Moving in too soon could push her into flight, wasting what little energy she has. Waiting too long could cost her entirely. For now, he remains still, marking each detail, letting the weight of the decision rest between observation and action. The distance is a buffer, but it is also a line. Cross it too early and risk panic, hold it too long and risk loss. The heat continues to thicken, the air shimmering harder as the sun climbs. Her breathing remains steady in its struggle. Inhale, brief hold, exhale, the same slow, deliberate pattern. Each repetition feels like a clock ticking down, each cycle a measure of how close she is to the point where she cannot rise at all. He stays, watching, as another low moan rises from her chest, trembles in the air, and fades. The silence that follows is deep enough to feel in his bones. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wildebeest calls, its voice flat and short. The lioness does not turn her head toward it. She is here, anchored to the ground by something more than fatigue, and whatever that is will reveal itself soon enough. For now, Elias keeps his place in the grass, steady and quiet, the fragile thread of connection between them stretched across 30 paces of hot, still air. Elias did not close the distance in a single approach. He knew from experience that every step toward a predator in distress was a test of both patience and judgment. He moved gradually, each pace measured, placing his boots lightly through the grass so that the movement disturbed nothing more than the air and the brittle stems. The lioness followed his progress with her eyes alone, her head remaining low to the ground, her breathing unchanged. There was no flattening of the ears, no sudden tensing of her shoulders. The signs of a defensive posture were absent. Instead, there was a steady, almost resigned watchfulness, her gaze fixed but softened at the edges, as though she did not have the strength to sharpen it further. When he was close enough to study the tension in her muscles but still well beyond her reach, he stopped. The ground between them lay open and exposed. No shrubs, no rocks, no broken terrain to act as a barrier. It meant she could see him clearly, but it also meant she had no cover if she chose to flee. The risk in this space was mutual. Any wrong movement could either drive her into sudden escape or trigger defensive aggression. He stayed perfectly still for several breaths, allowing the balance to settle before making any further move. The heat wrapped around them in waves, heavy and unbroken. There was no breeze to shift the scent of dust and sun-warmed earth. Elias watched her ears twitch once, then again, but her tail remained limp against the ground. When he was sure she was not preparing to move away, he lowered himself slowly, bending one knee to the earth, then easing the other down until he sat in the grass. The motion was deliberate. No jerks, no sudden shifts. His body kept within her line of sight at all times. He did not face her directly, but angled himself slightly to the side. Among large predators, a square, head-on posture could read as confrontation. Turning the body just enough could soften the shape of his presence. From this seated position he could see more detail in her condition. Her breathing was shallow, the skin along her ribs stretching slightly before sinking back in, and there was a faint ripple of muscle at the end of each exhale, as though her body was trying to release tension but could not. Her eyes half closed, only to lift again with each movement he made, however small. The interaction was not one of full trust, but neither was it rejection. It was something in between, a tolerance that could vanish if he pressed too far. Minutes passed in that stillness, marked only by the small sounds of the grasslands. The dry hiss of stems brushing together carried through the air, and the faint hum of distant insects wove a low, constant thread beneath it. Elias studied her posture, the weight of her head resting on the earth, the looseness of her forepaws where they touched the dust. A lioness alert to danger would hold herself differently, poised to lift in an instant. This one seemed anchored to the ground not by choice, but by the cost it would take to rise. Then, with a slow shift, she angled her head just enough to relieve the strain on one side of her neck. The movement revealed more of her hind leg and the darkened patch of matted fur that clung there. Even from here, he could see the dried texture of older blood and the dust embedded in it. The wound was not gaping and fresh, but it was significant enough to have cost her strength. Still, he sensed that this injury was not the only thing holding her down. There was something more, perhaps exhaustion from an effort still ongoing, or an internal struggle that left no obvious mark. Elias did not lean forward for a closer look. Even a subtle advance could shift the balance they were holding. Instead, he kept his frame still, letting the details come to him with time. His breathing matched the slow rhythm of hers, not out of mimicry, but as a way to remain steady in the thick heat. After a long pause, he spoke. Not a command, not a request, but a low reassurance. "You're safe here." The words carried only enough volume to bridge the space between them, their tone even and unhurried. She blinked once, the lids lowering in a slow, weighted motion, before her gaze returned to him. Her shoulders eased fractionally, though her body as a whole did not move. She seemed to weigh the choice between watching him and conserving her strength by resting. For now, she chose a balance between the two, shifting her gaze intermittently while keeping her head low. Elias knew this acceptance was thin, easily broken if he made the wrong choice. It was the kind of moment where every action carried a cost, and the stakes were clear. She was in no condition to waste energy on flight or confrontation, and yet any perceived threat could push her into doing exactly that. The heat made the air feel heavier by the minute. In the distance, faint shapes drifted across the sky. Vultures, still far, their spiraling flight unhurried. They were not here yet, but the knowledge of them hung in the air like a shadow of what could come. If her weakness continued long enough, they would not stay distant. This was the unspoken clock ticking between them, the time she had left before others noticed her state. Elias shifted only once more, easing the weight off one leg and letting his arm rest lightly on his knee. He did not break his seated posture, and his eyes stayed soft, avoiding the kind of fixed, direct stare that could read as a challenge. He let the stillness stand, knowing that patience was the only bridge from observation to action in moments like this. Forcing contact too early would close the distance between them physically but widen it entirely in trust. The lioness breathing remained steady in its weakness. A slow inhale, a brief hold, and then a release that trembled almost imperceptibly before settling back into the dust. Each cycle was another marker of her fragility, another reminder that her strength was finite. Around them, the landscape seemed to hold its breath with her. The dry stems barely moved. The hum of insects dipped and swelled without breaking the silence. Even the light seemed fixed in place, pressing down evenly across the plain. He knew that at some point, the moment to act would present itself. A shift in her posture, a sign of renewed effort, or the arrival of other threats. Until then, his presence was his only intervention. A quiet figure in the grass, far enough to give her choice. Close enough to respond if the situation changed. The gap between them was both a boundary and a connection, held by mutual stillness. In this fragile space there was no rush, only the steady weight of the decision to wait. Elias had not moved in some time, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. The heat of the day pressed down, clinging to the ground and making the air seem denser with each passing minute. The lioness lay exactly where she had been, her sides rising and falling with a rhythm that told him far more than any sound could. Her breaths were shallow, each one followed by a pause that seemed just slightly longer than necessary before she exhaled again. It was the pattern of an animal conserving every ounce of energy, keeping movements to the smallest scale possible to avoid tipping into exhaustion. His eyes traced the length of her body with quiet focus, starting from the tip of her nose and working toward her tail. The fur over her muzzle was clean, but as his gaze moved toward her hindquarters, he found what had been catching his attention since he first saw her, the patch of matted, darkened fur along her inner hind leg. Even at this distance, he could see the stiff texture of dried blood clinging to it and the dust settled into the edges where the wound had closed but not healed cleanly. It was old enough to have stopped bleeding freely, but not so old that it could be ignored. She held that leg at a slight angle, a position that eased pressure but also suggested she was unwilling to put weight or strain on it. The open plain around them shimmered now in the rising heat, the horizon line bending faintly in the distance. The silence was deep enough that the occasional hum of an insect seemed to stand out. Then the lioness moved, slow, deliberate, and with visible calculation behind each shift of her weight. She eased herself forward by just a few inches, enough to realign her posture. In doing so, her belly came into clearer view. Elias saw immediately that the curve was not the loose swell of a well-fed predator. It was taut, the skin stretched smooth and firm over the shape beneath. The fullness was too pronounced, too deliberate in its tension to be mistaken for anything but strain from within. His attention sharpened on the small ridges of muscle that appeared and eased under her skin as she breathed. They seemed to work in a slightly different rhythm from her chest, tightening in pulses that did not always match her inhales and exhales. Her tail lifted briefly, no more than an inch from the ground, then fell again, sending a faint puff of dust into the air. She exhaled at the same moment, the sound just rough enough to cut through the stillness. It was not a growl, not a warning, but simply the audible release of air from lungs under pressure. He kept his eyes on her abdomen, watching as it contracted lightly, then eased again. The pattern repeated, irregular but there. This could mean one of two things, and each carried its own dangers. If she was in the early stages of labor, the contractions would soon intensify, and the effort would demand far more of her body than she appeared able to give. Here, in the open, she had no shade, no shelter from the heat, and no protection from scavengers or rivals who might catch the scent or sound of her vulnerability. If she was not pregnant, the swelling could point to internal injury or illness, either of which could already be limiting her strength. In that case, her body was working against an invisible clock, and the outcome would depend on how quickly she could be treated, if she allowed anyone close enough to try. Elias resisted the urge to shift forward for a better look. Closing that gap without clear reason could drive her into a movement she could not afford, draining the reserves she had left. He adjusted his position only enough to see her flank more clearly, settling again without hurry. Her eyes were partially closed now, opening only when he made a small movement. The way she responded told him she was still alert, but that the energy to maintain vigilance was a resource she was choosing to ration. A light wind moved over the plain, barely enough to stir the grass. It carried with it a faint metallic tang, the smell of old blood warmed by the sun. Elias kept scanning her body for other signs, twitching in her hind leg, a shift in the set of her jaw, any subtle tremor that might signal pain or effort. When her head dropped fully back to the ground, he caught sight of a small flicker beneath the skin of her belly, so faint he might have missed it if he had been looking elsewhere. It repeated, irregular but undeniable, either the stir of life inside her or the spasm of muscle preparing for it. Her ears pivoted toward a distant sound, though she made no effort to lift her head. It was a hornbill's call, short and sharp, from somewhere beyond the low rise behind them. The response was instinctive, not deliberate, proof that even in her weakened state, some part of her awareness remained connected to the world around her. But the way she let her ears relax again told him that any sound not tied to immediate threat or need was of no interest to her now. The stillness returned, heavy and complete. Elias weighed his options silently. Moving closer now could help him confirm her condition, but at the cost of risking flight or defensive aggression. Either response would mean sudden, intense movement from her, a choice her body might not recover from. Remaining where he was meant more time without direct assessment, more time for her condition to worsen if it was already critical. In either case, the stakes were the same. If she lost too much strength here, she would not make it to shade or water on her own, and without either, her chances would narrow sharply. She rolled slightly onto her side then, enough to expose more of her abdomen to the light. The movement seemed to bring her a small measure of relief, her next breath coming deeper before settling back into the shallower rhythm. From this angle, Elias could see the rise and fall of her belly more clearly. The contractions, if that's what they were, had not yet reached the sharp, regular pattern of active labor, but they were present enough to suggest that something was shifting inside her body. Whether it would end with new life or a further decline in her strength was a question the next hours would answer. He kept his focus fixed on those movements, counting them without speaking, letting each one register before starting again. Around them, the grassland was unchanged, vast and indifferent, the shimmer of heat across the horizon making the distance seem even greater than it was. Yet here, in the small space they shared, the world had narrowed to the silent exchange between observation and endurance. The risks did not need to be spoken. They were written plainly in the slow movements of the Lioness, in the way her body both resisted and yielded to the effort within. The sun continued its climb, and the air thickened further. Every breath she took seemed to weigh more heavily against her, every pause between contractions stretching just slightly longer than the last. Elias knew that time was passing in more than minutes here. It was passing in the subtle markers of strength lost and effort spent, and in this place, that was the truest clock of all. Elias kept his eyes on the slow rise and fall of the lioness's chest, noting every pause that seemed just slightly longer than the one before. Her flank tightened again. That faint ripple beneath the skin carrying the same uneven rhythm he had been watching for the past half hour. The heat was climbing, and though she hadn't shifted much, the set of her ears told him she was listening to every movement in the grass around them. He reached for the radio clipped at his side, lifting it slowly so the motion wouldn't startle her. His voice stayed low, the words clear and without urgency, describing her position, the visible injury on her hind leg, and the swelling that suggested she might be in the early stages of labor. He added what he had been watching carefully, that she was breathing shallowly but was still responsive, not yet at the point of collapse, but with reserves that were clearly thinning. The reply came through with a faint crackle, confirmation that Ranger Mbeki was on his way. Elias clipped the radio back, settling into the same patient stillness. Every minute between now and Mbeki's arrival was a calculation. Nothing could change in his posture or behavior that might alter the fragile balance holding the lioness in place. Her eyes half closed again, only flicking open when a gust of wind lifted the grass in a nearby patch. She did not growl or shift her weight toward him, but she did not let herself slip fully into rest either. It was the kind of alertness that comes from necessity, not choice. Mbeki appeared some minutes later, cresting the slight rise with his approach as quiet as Elias's had been. He kept his pace slow, his body low, and his eyes moved first to Elias for a brief, silent exchange before settling on the lioness. In one hand he carried a pack with a water canister, in the other a tranquilizer kit, the kind used only when movement was impossible without sedation. Elias gave a slight shake of his head, signaling that no sudden action was yet needed. Mbeki crouched a few paces behind him, setting the kit down quietly in the grass. They both watched her for a long stretch without speaking. The stillness was broken only by the dry rustle of wind across the plain and the faint click of insects hidden in the grass. Mbeki leaned slightly toward Elias, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "She's holding steady," he said. Elias nodded, eyes still on her breathing. The option to intervene now was tempting. To close the gap, to tranquilize her for a closer check, to clean and dress the leg wound, maybe even move her to shelter. But that choice carried equal risk. In her state, the stress of sudden sedation and handling could tip her into full collapse, and if she was indeed in labor, the added strain could cost both her life and any cubs. They weighed the choice in silence, letting the minutes stretch. Every so often, her flank tightened in that same shallow contraction, followed by the small flick of her tail or the slight turn of an ear. She was aware of them, but she had not shifted in posture or shown signs of distress at their presence. That was the clearest signal to Elias that the safest action for now was no action at all. He glanced at Mbeki and spoke softly. "We wait. If she runs, she dies. If we push, she might too." Mbeki gave a small nod, the kind that carried agreement without further debate. They poured a shallow spill of water onto the earth a few meters in front of her, far enough not to intrude, but close enough that she could move to it if she chose. The damp scent carried on the breeze, but she made no attempt to rise. It was another sign of her exhaustion. Even the prospect of water wasn't enough to draw her forward. The sun continued its climb and the air grew heavier. The vultures in the far distance were still circling lazily, but their arc was tightening. The two men knew that their patience was also a race against those slow, descending spirals. Still, they held their positions, watching for the next shift, a change in her breathing, a movement toward the water, or the beginning of true labor. Nothing in the moment was decisive, but the choice to wait was the decision they could both live with. And for now, in the harsh openness of the plain, that patience was the most they could give her without taking too much away. The light had softened, the harsh white of midday giving way to the muted glow that came when thin clouds drifted across the sun. A cooler wind moved over the plain, carrying with it the faint smell of dust turned in distant animal tracks. Elias and Mbeki had held their ground for hours, their patience stretched but unbroken, each movement of the lioness studied for signs of change. Her breathing had grown deeper, the pauses between each rise and fall of her chest holding a tension that seemed to pull the air itself tight. Her tail twitched once, a small, restless movement that disturbed the dust where it lay. Then she lifted her head a few inches from the ground, the effort visible in the muscles of her neck. Her eyes were half closed, and from deep within her chest came a sound unlike the low moans Elias had heard earlier. It began softly, a low vibration in the air, before lengthening into a drawn-out cry that trembled at the edges. It was not sharp enough to be an alarm, nor forceful enough to be a challenge. This was something else entirely, a call that seemed to push through her whole body before spilling out into the open space around them. The sound held effort, strain, and a quiet urgency that made Elias's gaze shift to her abdomen. He saw it then, the strong, visible contraction that tightened her belly, the kind that left no doubt about what her body was preparing for. The realization settled between the two rangers without words. She was in labor. The contraction eased, her head lowering again to the ground. She took in a long breath through her nose, the exhale slower and heavier. A thin shiver passed along her flank, and her ears flicked back briefly before settling again. The air around them seemed to hold still, as though every living thing within sight had paused to listen. Elias glanced at Mbeki, whose eyes were locked on the rhythmic tightening of her sides. If this was the beginning, it would not be quick. The process could take hours, and with her weakened state, every minute of effort would cost her. If she failed to finish, the risk was fatal, not just for the cubs, but for her as well. A small broken sound escaped her throat between contractions, shorter this time, as if testing the air more than announcing herself. Elias spoke softly, almost under his breath. "You're almost there." It was not meant to carry far, only to hold a calm note in the moment. The lioness's head shifted slightly, though whether in acknowledgement or simply to ease the strain on her neck, he could not tell. Another contraction came, firmer than the last, the line of her back stiffening as she bore it. She adjusted her forelegs, drawing one inward slightly, anchoring herself against the ground. The clouds above thickened, muting the heat further. The change in air brought with it the faint scent of moisture, though no rain had yet formed. The rangers remained exactly where they were, knowing that any approach now could shatter the concentration her body needed for the work ahead. The only sounds were her breathing, the slow shift of wind, and the occasional distant call of an unseen bird. Each time a contraction gripped her, the cry came again. Not loud enough to carry far, but with the same tremor of strain. Minutes stretched, marked by the repetition of breath, tension, and release. The steady pattern confirmed what Elias already knew. The process had begun in full, and once it reached its peak, there would be no pause until it was over. The danger lay in whether her strength could hold through it. In the vast openness of the plain, with vultures still circling faintly on the edge of the sky, there was no margin for collapse. And yet, in the quiet between those trembling cries, there was also the smallest, stubborn proof of her will to keep going. The minutes after her last cry stretched into a stillness that felt weighted, every second measured in the slow rhythm of her breathing. Elias kept his eyes fixed on the tension along her flank, noting how each contraction seemed to last just slightly longer than the one before. The air was cooler now, the clouds pulling the brightness from the plain, but the ground still held the heat of the day. The lioness's forepaws shifted once more, claws extending briefly into the dust before settling back. She exhaled sharply, the sound edged with strain, and then her abdomen tightened with a force that made her entire body stiffen. The movement was deeper this time, her back hunching slightly as she bore it, the muscles working in slow, deliberate waves. The silence broke with a faint wet sound near her haunch. Elias leaned forward slightly, his posture still low, and saw a dark shape pressed against the curve of her body. At first, it was only a small, glistening mass, unmoving, the fur still slick with birth fluids. The lioness turned her head just enough to reach it, licking in firm, quick strokes that cleared the tiny nose and mouth. The cub gave no sound at first, only a faint, irregular twitch. She continued, her tongue working over its head and sides, her paw shifting to brace its small body. Then came the smallest gasp of movement, a slow, awkward stretch of a limb, the head lifting only to fall again. The first breath seemed hard-won, followed by another, shallow and uncertain. The cub's sides moved unsteadily, the effort of life just beginning. Elias watched the lioness pause to adjust her position, curling her body slightly to shield the new arrival from the open air. She licked again, more slowly now, each pass drawing the fur from wet to damp. The cub's eyes were closed tight, its legs splaying weakly before gathering in again. The plain around them remained quiet. the wind a soft hiss through the grass. The scent of afterbirth mixed with the dust, a marker that could carry to other predators if the wind shifted. This was the most vulnerable point, for both mother and cub. The lioness's own breathing had not returned to ease, her chest still rising in measured, effortful pulls. If she could not recover enough to continue, the rest of the birth could stall, trapping both her and any remaining cubs in danger. If she abandoned the new one to preserve her own strength, its survival would last only minutes in the cooling air. The cub shifted again, its head searching blindly until it pressed against the warmth of her belly. She allowed the contact, her foreleg bending to curl protectively around it. A faint sound escaped the small body, thin but sharp enough to cut through the stillness. Elias felt the meaning of it settle without thought. Not yet strength, but proof of breath. Mbeki, still silent beside him, kept his eyes on the open plain, scanning for the movement of vultures or the ripple of grass that would mark the approach of another predator. The lioness lowered her head again, resting her muzzle against her side just above the cub. Her tail lay still, her body curved like a wall against the world beyond her reach. The air seemed to ease for a moment, but the risks had not shifted, only paused. In the space between breaths, Elias knew the next contraction would decide whether this small beginning could be joined by another, or whether the strain would end here. The cub pressed closer into her fur, its body trembling once before going still, the faint rhythm of life tucked deep within the curve of its mother's side. The lioness shifted her weight, a slow, deliberate movement that stirred the dust beneath her. The first cub remained tucked against her belly, its damp fur now flattened by the steady rhythm of her grooming. Her breathing was still heavy, each inhale deeper than the last, as if she were gathering what strength remained. Then, without warning, another contraction tightened her frame. The muscles along her flank rippled with effort, her back arching slightly as she pressed into the ground. Her tail lifted and fell again, the tip curling before going still. Elias did not move, his posture unchanged, but his eyes sharpened on the hollow at her side where the motion was strongest. A few long seconds passed before the next push came. The tension in her body was clear now, and with it the soft, low sound she released, less a cry than a measured exhale that trembled at its edges. Near her hind legs, the faintest movement broke the stillness. A small, slick shape, even smaller than the first, slid into the dust. It lay motionless at first, a fragile outline against the earth, before the lioness reached back and began the same firm, methodical work as before. Her tongue swept over its face, clearing its nose and mouth, her paw adjusting its position to press it closer. This one was weaker. The first breaths were slower to come. Its limbs moved with less force, splaying outward before folding inward again. For a moment, the only sign of life was the faint rise and fall beneath its ribs. Elias felt the weight of that pause. Here, in this exposed place, any delay in strength was dangerous. The lioness continued her work without haste, her actions neither rushed nor careless. She paused once, lifting her head to draw in a deep breath before lowering it again, returning to the small body at her side. The first cub shifted slightly, pressing closer into the warmth of her belly, its tiny head nudging against her fur. Minutes passed, the wind moving softly through the grass around them. The second cub's breathing grew steadier, though still uneven, its head turning blindly toward the scent of milk. The lioness adjusted her body to accommodate them both, curling herself into a protective arc that shielded their fragile forms from the open plain. Elias remained exactly where he was, his presence no more than a still point in her periphery. She had not looked at him directly in some time, yet she had not driven him away. In the quiet, that was its own measure of trust. The light above shifted again, the sun dipping lower behind the thin veil of cloud. The air cooled slightly, though the day's heat still lingered in the ground. The cubs, their damp fur beginning to dry, nestled closer to their mother's stomach, their tiny bodies rising and falling in uncoordinated rhythm. The lioness closed her eyes for a moment, her breathing finally easing into something closer to rest. For now, the work was done, though out here in the open, the risk never truly faded. The wind stirred once more, brushing the grass in long, slow waves, and the family of three lay together in the shelter of her curved frame. The plain had taken on a muted glow, the hard glare of the day replaced by the softer tones of late afternoon. A low breeze moved through the grass, carrying with it the cool relief of approaching evening. The lioness lay curled around her newborns, their small bodies pressed into the warmth of her belly. The first cub shifted in short, unsteady movements, its paws kneading blindly against her fur. The second, smaller and slower, rested almost completely still except for the faint lift and fall of its sides. She adjusted her forelegs, drawing them both closer, her tail sweeping gently across the dust in a slow arc. Her breathing had steadied, though each inhale still carried the weight of the effort she had endured. Elias watched without moving, aware that any step forward now would break the fragile peace of the moment. Mbeki remained just behind him, scanning the distance with the quiet diligence of someone who knew the work was not over simply because the danger had passed for now. The plain was open, the sense of birth carried easily on the shifting air. Other eyes and other noses would eventually find their way here, but for the moment, the lioness had what she needed most: time and space. She lifted her head, ears forward, scanning the horizon. The muscles along her shoulders tensed briefly before easing again. Her gaze moved across the grass, settling for a heartbeat on Elias. There was no warning in her look, no sudden change in her posture, only a steady acknowledgement that passed as quickly as it came. She turned back to the cubs, licking each in turn with slow, deliberate strokes. The smaller one stirred under her touch, letting out a faint sound that was more breath than voice. She responded by shifting her body slightly, offering them better shelter from the wind. The sun dipped lower, its light catching the edges of the taller grasses in a pale gold shimmer. She rose then, her movements careful, as if gauging her own strength with each step. The cubs clung instinctively to the curve of her legs before being nudged gently forward by her muzzle. They wobbled through the dust, their tiny paws sinking into the soft earth, unsteady but moving. She paused once, looking back toward where she had lain, the impression of her body still marked in the flattened grass. Then she turned, guiding them toward the nearest patch of cover where the grass stood higher and the shadows had begun to deepen. Elias watched until the last trace of her tawny coat disappeared into the sway of the grass. The sound of her movement faded quickly, leaving only the whisper of wind through the stems. In the cooling air, the marks of her presence, the scent, the disturbed earth. The faint warmth where she had rested would linger only a little longer before the plain reclaimed them. The light thinned, stretching the shadows across the ground, and the space she had left behind felt quieter than it had all day.